Certainly.
Yesterday, a farewell public memorial and party was held at the Tokyo International Forum for Manga and Anime maestro Leiji Matsumoto, who died of acute heart failure on February the 13th, age 85. Maybe more than 3,000 people attended that event yesterday, flowing through to pay floral tributes and talk with fellows about what the man had meant across his life. Today, across an ocean as vast as the tears from yesterday, we ourselves bid farewell to our master, much in the same vein. But let us remember him not only as a brilliant artist, not only as a visionary whose dreams knew absolutely no boundary, but for the fact that his legacy touched almost every aspect of the early industry, from its foundation and then on to, well, almost to the moment that he passed away. Inspiring, captivating, driving men and women of our own little industry onto the boundless possibilities of, well, the human imagination. In the vast cosmos of creativity, Matsumoto Leiji's star will ever shine brightly, guiding future storytellers for generations onto new frontiers and uncharted territories. May his work continue to ignite our spirits, spark our dreams, and remind us that within all of us lies a universe waiting to be explored. Wait a minute, though. Wait a minute. This does not seem correct. Perhaps it's the late hour. I mean, the wake ended at 2 a.m. and it's 8 a.m. now, and I haven't really slept since then. Or perhaps it's the proximity to the memorial itself. Things came together yesterday in a way that have almost invalidated every note I had prepared for this. In fact, everything I had thought to present and now seems so unaccountably superficial and shallow in the face of such monumental grief that so many of us shared as we looked up at this magnificent mound of flowers provided by his daughter and his other siblings, a way for the fans to show their contribution. Something greater is needed at this moment, at this event. The fans' voice, the personal voice, not just my own, but those people with whom I shared conversations, not just at the event as well, but across the years about our master. Even though at the time I spoke to these individuals, I didn't realize that I was capturing something that would be so important down the line. Because, well, there's no easy way to say it. Matsumoto Sensei's impact on us is personal, whether we knew him or not, whether we met him or not. It's the way it goes with all creations. The creation itself, the art itself, the literature itself creates a bond between the consumer and the creator. That's a bit superficial, and I'm sure Helen will say something on that. But that's been the way it was for me. In fact, all the way back to where it began. 1991, the Sheffield Space Centre. It's a strange old place, is Sheffield. It seems to exist just to give people somewhere to come from, or possibly a place where some people end up. But right in the middle of it, there's this wonderful little place. One of the first places in Britain to catch on to the idea that animation and manga had a place. The chap who owned it, Dave, worked with Helen and others to make this happen. You can blame Helen, in fact. But as a consequence of that, and forgive this slight digression because it's important to set up how Matsumoto Sensei came into my life. In 1991, the owner and one of the staff members, an old mate of mine, went off to the fabled French comic convention at Angoulême. And lo and behold, was this pirate-hatted, whiskered, happy-looking Japanese chap, the guest there. And of course they recognized him because we'd all seen Arcadia of my youth at that time. Matsumoto Leiji, the father of Albator, the father of 3-9, the father of some of the greatest esoteric animation out there. It turns out that as Dave and Rick talked to him, he revealed that he'd only really come to the convention so he could get a free pass to France and thereby hire a car and himself, as soon as possible, abandon the convention and go touring around France and Germany, visiting sites associated with the filming of a number of his favorite romantic films from the period, especially this one, Marianne de ma Jeunesse, featuring the incomparable Marianne Holt, what the actress whose image is one of those little slots that seem to go into the creation of so many of Matsumoto Sensei's sylph-like, wraith-like female characters. The point is, he was a bit of a lad and not above taking a few chances. I love the idea when they got back and started talking about it. The thought of him driving an open-topped MG up and down the Autobahn, snapping shots all over the place like any mad tourist, simply for the love of it. It really tickled me pink. I really forgot about that, though. And I have to say, what has this got to do with me? Well, next step. Yeah, that's not exactly pretty, is it? But that's the way I was, 1996, fresh off to university. And more importantly, thanks to the study tour that the School of East Asian Studies ran from Sheffield off to Japan for some time. And there, thanks to my professor, Hasegawa-san, who will probably not thank me for this, got us to meet his old mate, this Matsumoto Leiji bloke, and sat us down for an art lesson, which was completely wasted on me. Though he tried to attempt to get us to conjure up images of Myrtle and Harlock and then paint them all in cells, and for the most part, making a mess of it, in the end, the whole thing devolved into a discussion about other cultures. And I get a feeling that's what he was after more than anything else. Oh, that's wrong. That is wrong. Sorry. He was kind enough during and after the event to hang around with spotty Herberts like me, who wanted to know a little bit more about his works, where his visions came from, why he made the choices he did. Is it not a wonderful thing to be inducted into the secrets of a master's work by the master themselves? Especially when he desired to know as much about our own lives and triumphs as anything else. He said he rarely got invitations from British conventions. Though in fairness, that's not my fault. Our convention from 91 to 94 was sponsored by the Space Center, the local comic shop. We had a budget of about, what, $1.50, and we gave that to Helen for bus fare. It was a much simpler time. Still, We talked and he listened. He laughed and he was earnest. Our badly translated explanations of everything and anything fell onto open ears, from the generalities of English life during the 17th century to the specifics of aircraft found aboard HMS Eagle during Operation Musketeer. And for the Zoomies in the room, that was Westland Wyverns, Sky Raiders, Seahawks, and Sea Venoms. He seemed to lap it all up. But he really was interested, absorbing knowledge like a sponge, as if experiences beyond his own were as dear to him as breathing out and breathing in. It was a wonderful thing, and it was over in a blink, but it stayed. My friends at the university all remembered him as the key point of their study abroad, not because he was any more profound than, say, Ichikawa Danjiro, the kabuki actor, or the fact that Princess Masako was nice to us, or that now the Empress was nice to us. He stuck in because he was willing to involve himself in us and selfishly take from us as much as he could in terms of sheer knowledge. Years later, I shared this particular meeting with a friend of his, Chiba Tetsuya. And when I got to that part, he just laughed. That was his feeling. And he suggested that people of his generation, the first generation of mangaka to come up in the wake of the Second World War and to start exploring the impact, the causes, the consequences, and all the energies that came out of that dark time, bred into people like himself and Master Matsumoto a need to know, so that they were simply not writing from the narrow perspective of a child growing up in a very restrictive environment. Everything was fuel to his fire. Clocks and dials, radios, maps, places, people, especially people. I'm surprised how much he knew about Sheffield. I mean, it's not exactly a place, as I say, crying out to a local lad in terms of culture, or at least it was not. The things that I found most loathsome about my hometown, its dark history, was something that Matsumoto wanted to know. After all, he'd lived in Kurome, a very similar industrial town, and Kyushu, which had been the subject of bombing. His own family's experiences, he wanted to measure against others. Again, not for morbid, not simply out of morbid interest, but to see how different people in different places cope with the same fundamental, reductive terror. Though ultimately why he became interested in Sheffield was this one photograph and what it implied. As you know, he was a particular, well, I wouldn't say fan, it goes beyond fan, a fan of warships and aircraft and all manner of technology, even though himself being a pacifist. I suppose it was the process and all the things that we as humans pour in to the weapons of war and make them icons, national or personal, of our own strengths and weaknesses. In this case, he was fascinated by the idea of how one simple development, in this case, Sheffield crucible steel, could go on to affect and afflict so much harm on the world. He pointed out to me that perhaps by the end of 1945, the Sheffield method had created more than 80% of the steel used in the Second World War. That's a crazy amount. Armor, gun barrels, the whole business. Especially when it comes to this. He shared this with me as well. the fact that he'd been given a secret, yes, absolute state secret copy of the battleship Yamato's blueprints shortly after the war, and used them, as Yamato fans will know, as part of his reference for creating the great ship in the first place for that series. I found that particularly odd. But trying to get back on track. I returned to Japan in 2001, back there to carry out research, having conned some poor organization out of a bucket of money, and made a little more from a group who were themselves little more than a Yamaguchi Gumi front company, owing to a late fiance's connections. I was all fired up and ready to study anime and puppets. You had to be there. It made sense. I was getting into ball joint dolls at the time, as normal anime figures were a little on the tentative side back in 2001. So I was all ready to soup them up a bit. Once again, here comes Hasegawa sensei, my old teacher, and says, "Remember my mate Matsumoto?" Well, how could I not? "Did you know his wife invented Rika-chan, the doll up here? You know, casual like, as you do. Let me get you together." I was half right, though. Master Miyako, Maki Miyako, is often miscredited with having invented Rika, whereas she did the concept works and all the art for the line, as you can see from this magnificent illustration here. I understand the family's decision to run themselves on a more traditional level when Matsumoto sensei and Maki sensei got married, to ensure that their children, in this case, their daughter Makiko, who is now the head of Reijisha, that she might be raised away from the spotlight, just as a child and not the daughter of Matsumoto Leiji. In fact, it's only been in recent years that she's even stepped out of the shadows. So carefully have the family as a whole, not just the Matsumotos themselves, but their brother, their siblings, and other relations, kept this like a precious secret. I wonder, though, what might have been if Miyako sensei had not retired from her own comic work. She has a remarkable style. What did we miss out on when she hung up her own nib? Or did she? There's always been that question as to exactly how much involvement Miyako sensei had on the Matsumoto Leiji brand as a whole. We know it was there, sometimes in lettering, sometimes in touch-ups, sometimes in training the master's disciples. But I do like to think that they did work hand in glove at some point. She's not really, I still can't see her as a stay-at-home mum. It just doesn't seem right. After all, every time I went up to Reijisha, she was always there, part and parcel of the team. But no matter how much I asked, no matter how much I prodded and poked, she was implacable, impossible to draw on the subject. Every time, every bloody time round at Leijisha, she would come in with the usual snacks and drinks and books and pens and paper. And the moment I raised that same finger, she would give me that iron look and stopped me cold in my tracks, stumbling out the same old words. "Not that nonsense again. Give it a rest. You're not here for that." She's a wonderful person. And I'm rambling again. I'm sorry. Fatigue and beer, that's what will do to you. I suppose I'm trying to pay tribute here. Tribute not just to the awareness of people, but to the awareness of family. And in this case, I really have to go to the root of it. Both of them, Leiji sensei and Miyako sensei, generous to a fault, absolutely determined, absolutely, what's the word? Unrelenting in their love for their fans. And I suppose you have to understand where this comes from. Then you will grasp the man better. I had this quote from Leiji sensei's brother, Susumu, the individual who the family placed its hopes on. After all, after the war, there was little enough money to educate any of the 7 children that they had. Simply because after what had happened to the father, Tsuyoshi Matsumoto, there was nothing for the whole. His mother, who had been a teacher before the war, retired to the position of raising the household unflinchingly, teaching her children post-war things like rag picking and rag weaving in order to make ends meet. Completely content, well, at least it seems, with the idea that her husband, Captain Tsuyoshi, Major Tsuyoshi, who had retired out of the Army Air Corps because he had lived through both the Chinese and the Pacific War and spent all those years sending increasingly untrained, increasingly weak boys out to die at the guns of increasingly more skilled American pilots. He refused to fly after the war, in fact, according to Leiji sensei, having sworn it off for life, despite commercial and military offers of employment. It came from something called Operation Tengo, he told me, the last great big push by the Japanese to stave off the American advance, sending out the Yamato and a host of other ships and aircraft to break the blockade at Okinawa. But as you may know, the Japanese military codes had long been broken. And so Yamato entered into a trap. And early in the morning of the second day of the operation, while Tsuyoshi's plane was flying above, its forward magazine exploded as a result of impacts from American bombs and torpedoes. And 20,000 feet up, the pilot's own plane was rattled and scattered with small pieces of debris. Immediately turning for home and landing, realizing that, as was often the case, 90% of his fighters had already gone. He walked out for the last time, past crying and screaming mothers, sisters, and children, demanding that they return their loved ones to them. Leiji sensei had said his father's humanity had been squandered like pocket change, and what was left to him after the war was no longer for sale. And that is why he didn't fly. And that is why the family entered into this sort of genteel poverty that ran down through the years. But it did not matter, not to the children who did their best, who understood their father's determination not to let his morals be used anymore, respected their mother for her firm support of their father's decision, and always honored them. And so, as Susumu went off to college in 1956, Matsumoto, who had been drawing since the age of 6 and had had some success in competition with that wonderful comic, The Honeybee Adventures, set off for Tokyo with a small amount of money in his hands, his school uniform on his back, and hope in his heart. You'll recognize this image, I'm sure. C-62-3 may have been the very locomotive that took Matsumoto from Kyushu all the way to Tokyo. Maybe not those coaches, but the idea of it. Imagine this scene at night, the glow of a rackety old station on a balmy summer's night, smoke billowing from a funnel, steam pouring out of every surface, the smells of oil and coke in the air, all the hustle and the bustle of people around settling into their carriages. Even then, admittedly, perhaps this is a later revision in Matsumoto Sensei's mind. To him, it seemed like a ship, something long, determined, and on its tracks in a linear sort of way. A great ship that was taking him into another world. Oh, perhaps there's something of the nostalgic in steam engines. We all love them when we're kids, perhaps because they are unusual in shape, unusual in sound, and in smell. But no matter how much I think about it, I cannot quite place what this must have been like in an era when diesels and electrics were still rare. And this whole process of travel, the preparation, the slow movement past landscapes, crawling with lights and life, that was part of it. But even more so, when he came to this is the Kanmon Tunnel, or at least as it was. It's now been turned into a footpath, but it represented one of the first great undersea tunnels that the Japanese made, from Kyushu all the way to Honshu. Not a huge distance, not much more than a couple of miles, really. But Leiji Sensei told me once that the moment he entered it, the roaring sound of the engine, the smoke billowing in from all the open windows in the carriages, the dimming of the carriage lights as the engineer had turned down all power, turned his entire world in that carriage into almost a sensory deprivation zone. Not through silence, but through a constant background roar. And in that darkness, in that noise, he said he started to see things. Characters, ideas visualized in front of him in a vivid green. This is ironically a symptom of ocular migraines, and it comes on after you've had a few. Although I'm not saying anything about Matsumoto Sensei, but the notion of the man experiencing his future self, as it were, all of his hopes encapsulated into this moment. Absolutely love it. Though I, as I say, fully admit this may be part of later self-revision, but it's still a nice tale. And then he arrived, flying out of the tunnel and onto the Honshu coast, freezing all of these moments in his mind. And here, once he'd arrived in Tokyo, he encountered the one thing he had not hoped to. As a budding comic artist, he didn't even know where to start. But as luck would have it, he fell into the cheapest apartment that he could find, and it just so happened that the average comic artist of the time, being relatively poor, all tended to focus in the same little area of Tokyo. And for a short while during the late 50s and early 60s, he lived with this creative group. Osamu Tezuka, Chiba Tetsuya, Ishinomori Shotaro, Yokoyama Mitsuteru, even that young upstart Monkey Punch, and a certain bright-eyed, cheeky Maki Miyako. Now, you may have all heard about the escapades of this notorious crew, thanks to Helen. Chases involving potentially illegal cinemas or raids to steal scrap paper and ink from waste bins for doodling. Even the enlarged all-night benders, which would brace themselves up for 24-hour work sessions. Such a thing it is to be young and have 10 toes, as the saying goes. But the real heart of this community, and the thing that goes on to explain more about why I pay tribute to Matsumoto Sensei so much, is the way it formed around everyone in the rebuilding of families, if you will. Every single member of this group had gone through the war and gone through it as a child, not understanding what they were seeing, and then having understood, sometimes having difficulty coping. Each one of them scarred by war and loss, and finding something valuable in each other's company as they strove to create something, not just to entertain and educate the children of that age, but to give them as much hope as they were trying to give their readers. It's best exemplified, I think, by the story of the whole crew crowded around in Matsumoto Sensei's apartment late at night with his father's old cine projector. Tezuka Sensei showing them all the daily strips from Tetsuwan Atom. Maki Miyako making changes. Matsumoto Sensei consulting on technology. Yokoyama Sensei desperately trying to take notes and pull together his own work. No envy, no competition. Every one of that little group existed on the very brink of poverty as artists for so long, but they worked knowing only that they were the outriders of something important and potentially huge. It all seems a little hard to believe today, does it not? Stories of Matsumoto Sensei curling up for a nap inside his own futon closet, as his rooms were constantly being invaded by his friends who were there to talk shop. Actually, that seems to be a common thing in manga. I'm told that Takahashi Rumiko did the same thing with her first studio apartment, in as much as she made her bedroom inside a futon closet, just so her assistants could have more room to work. I'm not sure how true that is, but I do like the idea. Perhaps this is why Matsumoto found such joy in this time. Living cheek by jowl with people who would be friends for life. Placing, according to Master Miyako, the phrase, et in Arcadia ego, above his door. I too have found Arcadia. Though not an omen of death, as it appears in the famous painting of the same name, just a beginning for him. The idea that this Arcadian vision, this utopian ideal, was what gave them the impetus finally to move forward. And in the end, as everyone's career began to take off and they all went their separate way out of that shabby little block of apartments, the Arcadian ideal stayed with them all. It was the brief beginning that drove everything else. In fact, when I was in Tokyo in 2001, I ended up actually living cheek by jowl with Master Mitsuteru, the master of mecha. And we shared many an afternoon discussing not just my slavish love of Giant Robo, but the remembrances of times past. At the time, I did not think to question all these masters about each other. You know, it would have been a great idea to get them all together in a room with a big bottle of scotch and then just record everything. The things I might have heard. It just goes to show, as I think, Helen, didn't you do a wonderful talk a few years back about how we are losing so much by not recording the early work of these people? I think I told you that after Sensei had died, how much I regretted not having spoken to him when he asked me. It would have made for an important and fascinating series, though. But at that time, during our conversations, he did go back several times to how the work ethic, the compassion, the generosity, and the sheer will of this young upstart Akira was a joy to see. As he says here, the fact that everyone was so open with their work. You can't imagine it today, in which everyone, even in the Reijisha by the end, as I know to my cost, is so protective of rights and legal issues and money that it's damn near impossible to get anything as creative done. But I suppose that's the way with any industry. You have to protect what you have or you lose it. But for me and for you and for Mitsuteru Sensei, there was something else about Matsumoto, something that needs to be paid tribute to. And that is his pure cheek, his unwillingness to be bound by anything. He'd made a name for himself in his early days as a capable artist and writer for girls' comics, working for publishers like Comic Margaret. But he didn't just want to work in what you might call a genred environment. He wanted to create things that would be approachable and accessible to everybody. That sounds a little bit superficial. He didn't just want to create boys' comics either. I think he took this from Tezuka. He mentioned once that of all the things that Master Tezuka had created, he found the Rimon no Kishi the most appealing. The Princess Knight, the story of Sapphire. Not just because it was well illustrated and supremely well written, but that it drew an audience in on one set of terms, in as much as it looked very, very much like a traditional girls' comic, but revealed its content and the character herself, themselves, having two hearts. A simplistic way of perhaps looking at the issue of male versus female. He took that idea and rode with it into a series, a book that I love, Mari of the Silver Valley. Now, I won't say too much about this because once I start, I don't stop. Because although it is an overlooked title, it's damn near hard to find in Japanese, and I don't think it's ever been translated officially. But it needs to be, because it represents the point at which Matsumoto Sensei broke into what we all now call his Leijiverse. He'd been given the title as a simple, fantastic love story. The editor wanted something that involved his elfin characters in some way. In a, what was the title he quoted? Oh yes, Midsummer Night's Dream as a comic. Fairies and spirits and ghosts and whatever. That's what the editor wanted. And for the first couple of episodes, that's what he got. Maria, the titular character, wandering through her world, meeting all manner of companions as they ventured into a world of fairly straightforward girls' comic romance. Right? Yep. Once the title had become popular, every month, and Matsumoto Sensei felt, okay, now I have control of this, he changed it. He's changed the setting, as you can probably just about see from the picture, to an exploration of LeBlanc's Kingdom of Mu. Check it out, look it up. A lost continent deep in the Pacific, ancient enemies coming from not just this world, but beyond it. All fighting over resources. He had taken a girl's love story and turned it into essentially Dune, even though he'd not read Dune at that time. He made heroism, ordinary heroism, as important as love and honor and empathy, and people lapped it up at the time. I still cannot quite comprehend why it is not published today, though I am told that because the rights are still owned by Mushi Comics, Mushiko, which isn't that one of Tezuka Sensei's old companies, Helen? Either way, here was a man, because of, at least in my idea, a man drawing on the subversive qualities of his friends, of his former life, of his now wife, in fact, looking to see what an audience wanted, not what a publisher felt that they could cope with, but what they could cope with. His views of heroism as well, steered not just by the common lot. Matsumoto was a man who appreciated a good film, this one in particular. Errol Flynn's Captain Blood, one of the archetypes that created Harlock and Emeralda, Stephen Myrtle. It's not exactly a hard film to track down, but it's not really up there with the greats of the golden age of piracy. Based on Sabatini's novel by the same name, it's quite simple. Peter Blood, an Irish doctor caught up in the Monmouth rebellions, sold into slavery, sent off to the Caribbean, breaks out, and more importantly, creates a bond between himself and his former rebels to do no harm, but to bring down the tyranny of the English crown. That's what makes it adventurous, perhaps, because it sidesteps the idea that goes, well, the more uncomfortable ideas that we have when involving piracy in a work. Perhaps that's what makes One Piece so popular. We can find a heroism within the figure laudable because they do not involve themselves with the brutality that otherwise go with fighting in a free way. Matsumoto Sensei's heroes then, unconventional, helpless as it were, completely bound on their way. And that's a thing that needs to be taken into account, and something I think needs to be brought up as tribute. People will tell you again and again and again that over his career of more than half a century, he redefined science fiction for a new generation, but he did more than that. At a more fundamental level, he redefined heroism, took away from it some of the more ancient characteristics of selfishness and brought into it a flawed nature, something that writers in America had been exploring ever since the time of E. Doc Smith. Now, during one conversation, he stated most firmly that any character that possesses no relatable qualities and struggles to give the reader any sort of reason to believe that they are flawed are of no account. He clearly believed and clearly held a belief that that faith in humanity requires positive and negative furies that contest within the human heart to make them both believable and powerful as protagonists and antagonists. If you look at Matsumoto's villains, not a single one of them is entirely unrelatable or absolutely without personal motivation. Even that rotter, Count Mecha. That's a sound enough point, though. It's very Buddhist. The balance between good and evil is found on the breadth of a hair. He went on then to say this: the idea that humanity reaching a place of utter bliss or outright evil is terrifying, with each state implying that the surrender of one's will to something outside one's control is to be avoided. There's the issue, isn't it? When you take choice away from a person, when you deny them liberty, when you deny them freedom, what makes his characters vital, what makes his stories real, is the struggle itself, the struggle as a goal. I like this idea, just as Matsumoto Sensei does. The idea that his characters go round and around and around, always searching but never grasping hold of anything except the possibility, the reward of the choice that so many people in his universe are denied. But it's not a choice that they simply make for themselves. It is a choice that they make for others, because every single one of them, the big three, Harlock, Emeraldas, and Myrtle, do it on behalf of others, but everyone in his world does. I am getting wrapped up again. I will hasten on. In fact, let's consider some of the characters for the moment. Whether it is the big three here or Matsumoto Sensei's own self-insert from Otoko Oido, or that massively overlooked comic Miraiza Ban, the time-traveling epic, pseudo-epic, that almost ties the whole Leiji-verse together in a quiet way. Each one is flawed, naturally, and each one, through their own actions and their own unwillingness to act against what they see as the moral wheel, are broken utterly, taken down to the very building blocks of their character before they are able to rebuild themselves, to take the decisions that only they can take as free people. That is an important thing to remember. Not just Harlock, whose deconstruction in Arcadia of My Youth is perhaps, the film version, I mean, the greatest example of this. The wounded and ruined captain returning to a shattered, invaded Earth, thrown down and further down until he has nothing left himself but the choice that he can make to take up the mantle of rebel, join his new friend Tochiro aboard this magically created Arcadia and venture out. All his heroes seek to live not just for a cause which might bind them to something beyond their control, but simply for the liberty to act. And by claiming that liberty, use it to liberate others and give them the right to choose. After all, I'm sure you have seen several versions of Harlock. In almost every version involves crew joining the ship and faced with an important choice, a choice which the majority of them fail. The question that casts them from the ship or binds them to it. Freedom. I want to be free. Because freedom itself is a binding form of existence, at least according to Matsumoto Sensei. He said, only once a person has given up everything and turned their back on all evil, that is the point at which they themselves can do anything. That's a common enough phrase. And he quoted something which I recognize as the Wiccan Rede. Do no harm, then you can do anything. I think there are multiple versions out there. The Wiccan there will know, of course, but I like the intention. Freedom has the price of empathy. You must do no harm if you wish to act. Ooh, I've been rattling on for a long time. But I'd like to start wrapping up again, bringing this tribute home with his unconventional heroes. The man clearly writing individuals to serve as a means to challenge conventional notions of storytelling, heroism, and as by concept, redesigning it. Sorry, I am really wiped out. By deviating from the more typical heroic archetype, he may have aimed to convey that heroism can manifest itself in any form and doesn't necessarily require any sort of perfection or conventional traits or standardized actions. You do this to be a hero, you do this to be a villain. His characters are more than ink on a page. They are icons of inspiration and resilience. Stoic rebels fighting against oppression, reminding us of the power of courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. Enigmatic figures who symbolize hope, compassion, and empathy in a world that we're all surrounded by a lack of common humanity. Through his vivid and evocative artistry, he has transported us for more than half a century into worlds of such breathtaking wonder and simplicity and beauty. His attention to details, whether it's intricate spacecraft design, mesmerizing panels, we are drawn into it. Where better could we lose ourselves in the grandeur of imagination? And whilst I can still speak, I open the floor to you. I'll rely on my comrades at ACON to take care of this for me. And so as the clock strikes 9 here, the deadly hour, I hand over to the staff. What are your memories? What do you have to say? What do you remember about Master Matsumoto? Thank you.